Okay.
Well, I'm so grateful to Michalyn for agreeing to do this with us. I knew Michalyn when both of us were living in Northern Virginia. I was at Georgetown first, and then she was at Georgetown sequentially after me. And we served in a relief society that was in a small branch for Cambodian and Vietnamese members of the church so that they could have their Sunday school classes taught in their native language. And then they had to suffer through us speaking English for Relief Society, but at least they got to have some fellowship and gospel instruction in their native language. So that's how we met. And Michalyn taught me a lot of what I know about service and the Relief Society. So I'm grateful to her for that. She also has a lot that she had learned that I didn't know about at the time. She grew up on a Seneca reservation in upstate New York near Buffalo, and until she was about 12. And her mother was the first Native American female graduate of BYU Law School. She has an amazing history of an amazing family history that I hope we'll start off with. But later in her life, after going to law school, she practiced for a DC law firm that specializes in representing Indian tribes. And then she also worked for 6 years at the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. And then she also worked for Larry Echohawk when he was counselor to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs before he was called to be a member of the 70. And like I said, she's a member of the Seneca Nation, and I now know she's also Beaver Clan. She went to BYU for her undergraduate and master's degrees, and as I already mentioned, she was at Georgetown for law school, like me. And I'm really grateful, like I said, to have this chance to have her have a conversation with us in the Oakland Stake about her own family history in the church and about her experiences. Recently, she's been serving on BYU's Equity Committee and has been interviewed on NPR about their report when it came out. So we have so many things we could talk about and learn from Michalyn. It's going to be hard to cover them all. But I want to start off with your family history, Michalyn. I found it so amazing. Michalyn wrote an article about her great-grandmothers who were the pioneer ancestors for her in terms of accepting the gospel and accepting the missionaries' message when they came onto the reservation in the 40s. And interestingly, this is the same reservation that missionaries in the very earliest days of the church came onto, but were not received as well as they were by Michalyn's two great-grandmothers. So Michalyn, why don't you tell us a little bit about that story and about how those great-grandmothers and your grandmother and your mother in this great matrilineal line have influenced you and your testimony.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for hosting this series of important discussions and for inviting me to be part of it. I think it's just great. I think, you know, one of the challenges of our era is how we truly have our hearts knit together in love. And I think the beginning of that is being able to understand each other's experiences and even if they're hard to hear, and facing things as they really are. That's truth, right? It's things as they really are. And so I think in the series of speakers and the undertaking that your stake is doing is really a model for the church on these issues. So I grew up in Western New York on what's called the Cattaraugus Reservation. And I've got a little map. Let me see, I'm gonna test you'd think I would be really better at this after the last year plus of teaching online, but I'm still not that good at it. So let me try to share this screen just so you can get a visual of where we're talking about. Many of you may not have known that there was such a thing as Native Americans in New York and Indian reservations in New York. Let me share this real quick here. So this is a map of very much Western New York. You can see on the border of Lake Erie and what I call a really narrow little neck of land between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And you can see that my reservation, the Cattaraugus Territory, has a little bit of beach on Lake Erie for whatever. That was not worth much in the 70s when I was growing up. It was Lake Erie was a mess, but you can see the Allegheny Territory and a little tiny dot that is the Oil Spring Territory and a Niagara Falls Territory and Buffalo Creek. Those are our teeny tiny reservations of what is left of our land in New York. We were part of what's called the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. Our role was as keepers of the Western Door. They conceived of themselves as they lived in these long houses, and they conceived of the nations as being in one grand longhouse that stretched all the way across what is now New York. And the Mohawks were keepers of the Eastern Door, and the Seneca were keepers of the Western Door, and the Onondaga and Oneida and Cayuga were there, and it sort of mapped into the land by the five Finger Lakes. Those are each sort of symbols of the people and whose land they believed it was. So I grew up in that little Cattaraugus. It's a very rural part of New York. We lived, my parents met at BYU. So as Carrie Lynn was saying, in the 1940s, missionaries came to the Cattaraugus Reservation, and they really found two people, and they happened to be my two great grandmothers. One named Nina Tall Chief Seneca and another named Florence Parker. They were already grandmothers at this in the 1940s, and their children were married. That was my grandparents, and but it happened that these two ladies, independent of one another, accepted the message of the missionaries and became sort of the little nub of a congregation that is still there. It's kind of gone back and forth between being a ward and a branch, and right now it's a branch. And it was a branch while I was growing up, and then it became a ward for a while. I remember in those days we had what was called a Mary Miss class. I guess it was the 11-year-olds or 10-year-olds. Anyway, all the way through primary, I was the only one my age. And I think back of the people in that little branch whose calling was to teach me on Sunday a lesson, and they prepared the visual aids and they took it so seriously. And I really appreciate that they're, I think very fondly of the teachers who accepted a call. Many of them were sort of relatively new converts. I always remember my one teacher, primary teacher, who she had these two great big W's. We were studying the prophets, and this was Wilford Woodruff, and she had cut out these great big W's and for Wilford Woodruff, and then she flipped them upside down, and it stood for marvelous missionary. And I just think about the earnestness with which she taught that class, and it was just me. And I didn't really have much of a choice but to pay attention, I guess. And so it was a blessing to grow up in that little congregation, and we had a lot of opportunities to serve, and it was a close-knit community. But eventually, so in the late 1940s, my grandmother, her name was Norma Parker Seneca, she got baptized as well. My mother was about 7 years old when that happened. And then, eventually my mother came of age and was baptized. And so as Carrie Lynn says, this sort of matrilineal line was deeply faithful. When they brought my aunt, who was the oldest of the grandchildren, to BYU, to go to BYU, they drove from New York across the country so that those two, we call them the Grahams, my great grandma Parker and my other Graham, so that they could go to the Salt Lake Temple and receive their endowments and be sealed to their husbands who had passed. And so, they, I often remember my great grandmother who lived with my grandparents reading a really huge Book of Mormon, like the largest possible print Book of Mormon, and she lived to be 106. And she would read with a magnifying glass these largest print Book of Mormon ever. And she had lost her first family in the pandemic of 100 years ago. Her husband and two daughters died in the flu pandemic of the 1910s. And then eventually she remarried, and that was my great grandfather. And so she told me that the pain of that loss, that nothing had helped it until she met the missionaries, until she started reading the Book of Mormon and understanding the plan of salvation. And they, I'm going to try to find a little picture of the, all right, here. These aren't the best pictures, but they are them real old. My on the left is my great grandmother Florence Parker, who as I said, lived to be 106, and was she would say, I don't know why I can't die, but she was, she one of the things I love about her is that she got clothes ready for her husband, who was not interested in coming to church, but she got Sunday clothes ready for him every week from the 1940s until the late 1950s, when there was a particular missionary who connected with him. William was his name. And one day he put on the Sunday clothes and went to church. He got baptized and became a deacon. And my mother remembers him passing the sacrament. I think he only lived for about another year, but he was a deacon, and he had a palsy in his hand that caused him to shake, but he was there with the deacons passing the sacrament. And then on the right, that's not a great picture of her, but that's what we called her Grandma Jake. And her husband was named Jacob Seneca, and I don't know why, but everyone called her Grandma Jake. And then that's my grandparents. Again, my grandfather never got baptized, but my grandmother was a very faithful member of the church and raised her children. They were an unusual couple in that for the reservation, in how much they valued education and insisted on their children's education. So those two Grahams, one of the things they did was help raise money to build a chapel on the reservation. And you saw how small the reservation is. There's not much territory. So for the tribe to give the church use of this land was quite a miracle. And so that's the condition they put on it was it had to always be used as a church. And there is a cemetery out behind it, and anyone from the tribe has to be able to be buried in the cemetery. And so that is sort of the facility there. And
that's the condition that it's in today, right? Because
yes.
You yourself, I remember
Yeah.
reading, you yourself made and sold traditional Seneca corn soup, right?
Yes.
To raise money to add on to the original building that your
Yes.
great
So
grandma.
that's the fancy second version. When I was growing up, it was a very simple building. At the time, the church required the local congregations to raise a certain percentage of the money for the building fund, and the first Saturday of every month, we made these traditional foods, um, uh, and um, sorry, that's a bad picture, but this is corn soup. It's a kind of a white corn, as you can see, and kidney beans and kind of a salty broth, and corn bread, which is sort of it's got a little bit of a Play-Doh-y texture, but we like it. And those traditional foods where everybody would come on the first Saturday of a month and get those traditional foods. Now, that was not the only fundraising mechanism we had. It was the 1970s, and so we put on a variety show a la Donnie and Marie as well, and there was a lot of musical talent in the little branch, and we did a show, and including, I think I was about 10 years old, and I did a comedy routine, which was totally plagiarized from like Reader's Digest by my mother. With my mother as the comedy ghostwriter, it was quite a little embarrassing, embarrassing chapter of my life. But we did it for the church that stands there now.
Yeah. And I mentioned this today in our Sunday school class in our Moraga ward that there was also a farm, right? That was part of the land that the church used for as like a welfare
Yes,
farm. Do you have any memories of laboring on that
I
farm
do.
as a
Yes,
child laborer?
I remember picking potatoes and corn out in the fields behind the church. It's now an apple orchard,
Okay.
but they grow corn and apples out there still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I love that you got to know both of those great grandmothers, right? You were
Mhm.
they were alive long enough for you to actually know them and to sit with them in church
Yeah.
and learn their testimonies from them. Um,
Yes.
so I'm going to try now to zoom out a little,
Okay.
um, and I'm going to share my screen for just a brief time. I don't want to take very much of the time away from hearing from Michalyn, but just to move our context out a little bit, so so we know kind of Michalyn's family history of her family's experience with the church. Um, Unusual in many ways, in that the Seneca did hold on to some of their land in New York and were not driven west, further and further west. In preparing today, I was hoping and searching for some kind of gospel topics essay, similar to what we have now on Blacks and the priesthood. And the closest I could come up with is this essay entitled Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter day Saints. And within that essay, there's a section, just a few paragraphs long, about the church's history of relations with Native American people. And this is just one little bit to make it fit on one screen, but um, it highlights what I see as a little bit of a inconsistency or perhaps a dichotomy. So, on the one hand, Latter day Saints view Native Americans as a chosen people, that they're fellow House of Israel members, descendants of the Book of Mormon peoples, and heirs to God's promises. So, on the other hand, when both many Native Americans were driven west, kind of at the same time as early Latter day Saints were driven west, there wasn't as much empathy as you might hope when it came to settling the Utah Territory. So Brigham Young's policy, at least early on, was to accommodate and pursue peace. But this sentence at the end of this paragraph is what I want to sort of ask Michalyn about today. This policy emerged unevenly and was inconsistently applied. That's just putting it very vaguely, very generically,
Yeah.
but just to sort of see the timeline. So this slide's kind of showing us the 19th century, very, again, like zoomed way out. And we can't go into a lot of details, but just to show that, 1830, when the church was organized, was the same year of the Indian Removal Act by the U.S. government, and that led to what's referred to as the Trail of Tears. Then in 1847 was when the first pioneers reached Salt Lake, and there were already several existing um, tribes on the land. And there's a lot of stories, but one key is the death of a man named Old Bishop, which was very violent, and the body of Old Bishop was not returned to his people, and this was very upsetting and led to an escalation in violence in which there was an outright campaign for 17 months to exterminate hostile Indians. And many more Native American lives were taken than Mormon casualties in that 17 months of violence. In 1852, the Utah Territory legalized slavery and at the same time passed an act for relief of Indian slaves. So again, we can't go into a lot of detail on this, but it was intended to be a benevolent policy of buying Native American children from traders who had already enslaved them in order to bring them out of being maltreated. And then some of these Native American children were raised in Mormon homes. Um, Experiences varied in that situation. But there were also some great, I just have a few names up there of some of the chiefs of various tribes in Utah who really were incredible peace in the Utah Territory, and to forgive what were seen as extremely horrific acts against their people. So now I put Michalyn's family onto the 20th century timeline. In the 1940s was when her Grahams were receptive to the gospel as brought to them by the missionaries on the reservation. Then kind of the two things in the 20th century that I want to ask Michalyn to help us understand and learn from a little bit more were part of a larger trend, really, to as Michalyn put in her article, the philosophy of this particular Christian man was to kill the Indian and save the man. And so the idea was to take children out of the reservation, put them into boarding schools, and in the church's case, um, it was this Indian place put into foster families, ostensibly in order for them to receive a better education and give them leadership opportunities that they might otherwise not have. So those two programs were kind of concurrently happening in the 20th century. And I had always noticed growing up visiting my family in Logan, Utah, we would pass through Brigham City whenever we drove to Logan. And so in Brigham City was one of these federal program schools. So the Intermountain Indian School in Brigham City was opened in 1950 and then closed in 1984. And that was not a church school. That was a federally run program. And then the Indian placement program, I think the very first placement was a young, I don't remember, Navajo probably, right?
I think so.
Asked to be taken in as a foster child, but then the program kind of Spencer W. Kimball was on a committee at that time and really pushed it, pushed it along and made it, expanded it, and it lasted for decades, where children were taken. Sometimes they were orphans and didn't have parents. Sometimes they had parents and were still taken away from their parents. And there's actually some litigation now over abuse that some children experienced in the Indian placement program from their foster families. So, um, you know, again, these are sort of difficult things to learn about. You can understand where the good intentions lay, but you can also see that there was a perspective on the part of members of the church that, our way was the right way, that we were civilized in terms of believing in land ownership rather than communal use of the land. So we needed to bring, others of different backgrounds over to our way of thinking, was kind of the way we approached things. And if we didn't see eye to eye, and then it led to violence. So, and then in the 20th century, again, still this idea of sort of our way is the right way. So we should not allow speaking of native languages or practicing native cultural practices. Instead, we need to, bring these children over to sort of civilization, to our to our way of doing things. So that's kind of the really very general view. But I want to ask you, Michalyn, sort of as you were, I don't know when you started grappling with some of this history, or I know that for a fact when you worked for Larry Echo Hawk, you were very involved in listening sessions with Navajo people who were still feeling the effects of this placement program years down, generations later.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. So the federal government undertook a policy. Uh, so the federal government's policy toward tribes and toward Indian people has changed, decade by decade. And one of the policies you mentioned removal, where the idea of what they called the Indian problem, the solution would be if they could just get them to leave their lands in the East, where they were occupying lands and resources that Americans really wanted, including when there was gold discovered on what was the Cherokee territory protected by treaty. So the removal policy said, if get them west of the Mississippi, we'll preserve that as long as the rivers flow and the grasses grow, right? We'll preserve that to them. So we'll just trade. And it was supposed to be voluntary, but wasn't. Then, of course, as the sort of the appetite for lands grew and westward expansion grew, there were the tribes again, basically in the way by holding their lands communally. And so at the end of the 19th century, there was a policy of the federal government that was called Allotment and Assimilation. And the Allotment and Assimilation policy was meant, President Theodore Roosevelt called it a great pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. They wanted the lands not held communally and protected by treaty, but if it could be broken up into individual ownership, and then they'd give them some tools, they could farm that land. That was the idea. And that if they would let go of their sort of tribal identity, including tribal language and religion and traditional practices, if they could just let go of that, essentially we would hand them the gift of civilization. They could be more like us. They would assimilate. And nothing wrong with assimilating, but this was a policy of forced assimilation and forced allotment. And part of, as Carrie Lynn mentioned, part of the one of the tools for doing that was the boarding schools, where a man named Colonel Pratt, who had the philosophy, kill the Indian to save the man. They just took a lot of Indian children, including he started something called the I believe it's called the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And one of my grams, what we called Grandma Jake, she went when she was 7 years old to that. She and one of her sisters, and were there for 4 or 5 years, where the education that they were receiving was as domestic servants. And for the girls, they would learn to sew, they would learn to clean, and then they were, as young teenagers, placed with wealthy white families where they were especially vulnerable. So even getting out of, they were punished for speaking the language. But it went on for so long that my grandmother, Norma, who lived until the 1990s, uh, uh, was also at a boarding school. And uh, she is the only of her sisters. She had, I think, 5 sisters and 2 brothers. She's the only one who spoke the language. And she had been to the boarding school. She had been punished for speaking the language. But she was, if I say so myself, quite a smart lady, and she retained the language. And she went to that schooling. My grandfather, who would become her husband, felt there was not good educational opportunities on the reservation. And so he asked the local Baptist minister if he could go to Oklahoma, where there was what they called the Bacone Indian School. And when he was 12 years old, he got on a train and went to Oklahoma. He didn't come back until he had an associate's degree as a machinist when he was about 20. And so what you find is this great, what Theodore Roosevelt called a pulverizing engine for breaking up Indian lands, was a pulverizing engine for Indian families. And children were really ripped from their parents and their primary families of origin. This went on for many, many decades. Carrie Lynn mentioned that when I was working for Assistant Secretary Echohawk, we were facing a crisis of youth suicide, and in particular in the Navajo Nation. We went to go see what we could do as the Department of Interior to help. And there was one of the things that we heard was that they are still very much grappling with the generational harm of having those families broken up, that it caused the children to not be able to form primary bonds, that it was so upsetting for the parents, that it made them strangers in their own homelands and cultures and languages where they didn't really fit either place. And that in the absence of mental health services and things like that, a lot of people turned for those traumatic wounds, that mental pain, to drugs and alcohol. And they were telling us it was at the root of a lot of the suicide, that those children became parents who lacked fundamental family skills and bonding skills, parenting skills with their children, and that it has had this echoing reverberation through the generations. Now, for the church's part, it's easy to sit in the 21st century and look back and say that was a bad idea. I want to credit President Kimball with trying to do what he thought was best from a place of love. And there you can hear very mixed reports of people who loved their experience and were able to thrive. They didn't go for years at a time. They lived with church family members. They lived with church families during the school year and then went back. And I don't think there was exactly the same sort of get rid of all your traditions philosophy underlying it. But I think that there was also an unspoken message communicated to a lot of the participants in these programs that there was something inferior about what was happening on the reservation, and that this is what sort of a church family looked like. This is what a church member behaves like, and inculcation into church culture that I think had some consequences that we can be honest about, even while we credit the participants with seeking to do their best for the people who they took in.
Yeah. I remember seeing in something that you wrote or something that you spoke about this notion that is common in many Native American cultures of 7 generations that you should be kind of familiar with and thinking ahead or thinking back and forward both directions to 7 generations. And that seems like something that resonates with us in the church, where we are so into our family history, and we are trying to turn our hearts, and it seems so compatible with the doctrine of the church, and yet so incompatible with this action of sort of, as you said, pulverizing families. And um, it's hard to learn about that. And um, I just want to hear from you how it doesn't cause you to say, well, there's something wrong with this church, or to or why we shouldn't tend, I think, as we do, to not examine this, or to not look into this, or to not talk about it. Um, Sort of what's the right balance? Why should we learn about it? And when we do learn about it, how can our reaction be one of faith, or even building our faith rather than rejecting the church?
Yeah, I mean, I've always understood that the Lord is perfect. The church is comprised of a bunch of imperfect people who are doing our best. And, it really is interesting how patient the Lord is with us as we figure things out. Um, and, one of the things that's interesting, this is related, but I'll get to the point, I think, in a minute. But one of the things we've been finding, as my mother has really been doing a lot of family history, there were all these Protestant missionaries that went to the reservation in New York through, many generations. And they had an interesting idea of what they were doing there. They were Presbyterians and Baptists, and I don't know. And they would baptize a bunch of people. They would tell them they had to be baptized or they were going to hell, and write their names down. And then when they didn't do exactly what they wanted, like you missed church for a few weeks, or it turns out you're not, uh, you're drinking, or you have another girlfriend or whatever, they would excommunicate them and pretty easily and write their names down. And those missionary journals from those Protestant missionaries are some of our best resources for figuring out who was related to who, what their birth dates, and it has facilitated a lot of temple work for our family. And I think about that of, I suppose from a doctrinal perspective, I would say these missionaries for these Protestant sects were well-meaning but misguided. And the Lord was able to take of their offering and make something much more of it. And so I guess in that sense, I have the same hope in the Lord of, blessing individuals and making more of our offerings than we could have envisioned, right? And so one of the things that I think, one of the reasons I think it's important to think about this is because I I understand, the Book of Mormon keeps saying that it is written to the Lamanites. Now, I don't have a total grasp on like who exactly that means. We see in the introduction to the Book of Mormon that the Lamanites are among, no, American Indians are among the ancestors of, no, how does it go? Sorry.
Independence. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. So, uh, I don't, that doesn't tell us, which tribes or whatever, all that kind of stuff. But the message is there that know ye that you're of the house of Israel. And to me, I see that, it really matters to me that these are, in some sense, descendants of Joseph with the coat of many colors, who was sold into Egypt, and what the Lord was able to do with the dastardly deed of the brothers. He was able to use Joseph as a tool for saving the house of Israel from famine, that Joseph saw the 7 kine or whatever, he was able to help the Pharaoh store up grain against a time of famine. I see echoes in the story of the American Indians, echoes of that story, where if we accept Lehi's premise, and I think Mormon and Moroni's premise, that these people in the end would receive the Book of Mormon, in some ways, the Book of Mormon itself is a kind of grain stored up against a time of spiritual famine. It is the stick of Joseph, and Joseph has again, and his descendants, this coat of many colors, has again provided a way to save the house of Israel with another testament of Jesus Christ. I see a further echo that in the, it is a remarkable story that all these efforts to stamp out tribal identity, stamp out tribal religion, stamp out tribal families, they failed. I mean, they harmed a great many individual families, but there still is such a thing as a Native American in the 21st century. There's still 574 federally recognized tribes. I think there's about 2 million Native people. That population is growing. And to me, I think in the things that the tribes, the wisdom that has endured these assaults, that survived the pulverizing engine, I think there is tremendous truth and important lessons that the Lord has preserved in tribal cultures and principles. One of those, I think, is the 7 generation principle, and I'll give it. It has different iterations depending on the tribe, but from my tribe's history, the law that governed the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy, in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. So they had a governing council, and the council members, the people who were set to be the deliberators, the delegates to that council, they were charged with considering the impact of their decisions in the Iroquois Constitution, with considering the next 7 generations. They could be removed from office if they didn't, or if they did things that were self-interested. So how might that principle, if we, I'll just say the United States, were to look to this traditional principle and say, we're going to hold our leaders accountable on whether they act in the long-term interest on the next 7 generations, or whether they're acting in self-interest in some way. And use that principle of accountability. That's just one example of a great many examples of what I think are contributions that, if we can look to this history and change our mindset a little bit, it's always been get rid of what you have and come embrace what we have, because we'll civilize you. Keeping in mind that these were civilizations that endured for many millennia before the settlers came and asserted that it was their manifest destiny, that they had basically had the imprimatur of God to do whatever they wanted with the people in the land. Anyway, that's one way I think about it. There's a little girl, I like to tell this story, a little girl who was doing her report in 5th grade or whatever it is about the Senecas. And she called me to interview me about for her little report. And I think it's interesting because a lot of times in education, whatever year it is that you learn about the Indians in your state, it really consigns to history the tribes, right? They're not so much living 21st century presences as they are, oh, here's what they wore, and this was the kind of, homes that they lived in, and all the kids do those projects that really consign tribes and tribal people to a long ago past, right? Anyway, this little girl calls me to interview me, and she says, when you were a Seneca Indian, what was that like? What did you eat? What did you wear? And it really helped me understand that we have been so eager to sort of put tribalism, meaning American Indian tribes, into a historic past rather than inviting their participation in a contemporary future, and valuing what they have to bring. And I think there's lessons in that for us as missionaries out across the world, that the Lord has given as much truth as people will receive all over the world, and that there are ways in which the people that we meet as missionaries can also bring important truths to us through the Lord. He speaks to people in their own symbols and in their own language, as much truth as they will receive. That's been my experience with the tribes. And so I think that's one of the reasons to embrace sort of the diversity of gifts that the Lord has given to all of his children, that coat of many colors,
Yeah.
all knit into one.
Yeah, that we all get lifted up together when we lift up others. I also liked, I can't remember where I saw this, but your reference to the Book of Mormon scripture that we make a covenant when we're baptized to mourn with those who mourn.
Mhm.
And so part of our baptismal covenant is really um, to know the history of pain as well as the history of success or the history of achievement. It's to also know each other's pain through the generations.
How could we effectively mourn if we aren't willing to hear their sadness or their pain, or we're so eager to sort of have them get over it or something? This is what we're finding right now. I'm on the BYU Committee on Race, Equity, and Belonging. Uh, President Worthen, the president of BYU, assembled this committee last summer in response to the charge from President Nelson in a joint statement with the NAACP, charging educational institutions and all institutions to root out racism. President Worthen, following that charge, assembled the committee and asked us to look at the policies and processes and et cetera at BYU. And we in the end generated a report and some recommendations. What we found was that a lot of the students at BYU, especially students of color, but especially Black students, are isolated and are bearing too much of the burden of trying to educate their fellow students. We want university students to be what we call cross-culturally competent, able to talk and listen and navigate across cultural differences. That's a really important skill for a university student to gain. And we have not been as intentional as we need to at BYU about ensuring that we the educators are helping them get those skills. And in some ways that's defaulted to the students of color are bearing a lot of the burden of trying to help people navigate what not to say, or how not to approach even something like touching a Black woman's hair or something like that, right? Like the students are having to do a lot of that educating, and that was one of the primary findings of the committee.
Yeah. So how can we, I
Mhm.
messaged Michalyn when I first got called onto this committee and said, "Hey, we were just starting and we're trying to draft our mission statement." And, I saw BYU's mission statement and
Mhm.
I just, I was like, help me, advise me. So,
Yeah.
we're still looking for that help, I guess, for that advice. How can we, as members of the Oakland stake, take to heart findings of the report of the BYU committee? How can we uh, do more
Yeah.
to be cross-culturally literate, um, to mourn with those who mourn, to
Mhm.
keep our baptismal covenants? What can we do? What should we be doing?
Well, I think what you're doing is a great start. Is just being willing to have somewhat difficult conversations with with your dukes down. There's hardly any conversations where people don't have their dukes up these days, and so um, instead of defensiveness, love and empathy. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everybody's point of view or with every solution that people uh, offer, but to listen with love, I think is a really a fundamental gift that we, as members of the church, as people of the covenant, to mourn with those who mourn, to comfort those who stand in need of comfort, to bear one another's burdens, to understand those burdens is the first step. I did pull a quote that I think is kind of key to what the charge that was given to the BYU committee. And again, we were sort of operating in a very specific context of BYU, but we tried to be guided by President Nelson's call to action. And so this was one of our guiding principles. Is it sharing?
Yes.
Racism, whether implicit or overt, whether individual or institutional, is a highly destructive and complex feature of our society. I would just say we in the church are not immune. Just as sort of the church in former days sort of reflected the society that they were in with regard to slavery sometimes, or boarding schools, that kind of thing. Indeed, it is a sin with consequences that detrimentally impact the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being of BYU students, faculty, and staff. I turn frequently to this idea from Dr. King when he was imprisoned in Birmingham. Um, and I really try to think about this from the perspective as someone who's educating lawyers who are about to take a position of some influence in society and have a credibility that comes with being admitted to practice law. And he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I think this next is a very true principle that we sometimes lose sight of. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. In other words, we have to care about the injustice that plagues our brothers and sisters, to think of ourselves as tied in that single garment of destiny. Human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men, I would add, and women willing to become co-workers with God. Um, so, I think about the ways in which I am tied in ways that I can't be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and vice versa. That's what Dr. King was teaching in the letter from Birmingham jail. And I think it's a principle of the gospel. We think about the great plan of having everyone ultimately sealed together to the Savior. I think, ultimately we are saved, with our kindred dead, right? We're all trying to get tied up together through the great sealing power. In that sense, we have a mutual destiny. Um, uh, and so I think about that, and I think there are elements of eternal truths in what Dr. King is saying here.
Thank you. That quote was what I was trying to say earlier, but I couldn't quite find the right words about all of us being lifted up together. When we lift up any one of us,
Yeah.
any part of us, we are all lifted up together. Uh, well, I think we're pretty much at our hour. Mandy, I don't think we were planning on allowing time for questions. I hope not, because I didn't really leave any time for questions. But I'll turn it back to you to decide how we close if we need to end right now.
We don't have to end right now. I don't know if there's questions. If anyone has questions, usually we have people put it in the chat, and we didn't really do that ahead of time. So let's see if I have any questions in the chat. Oh, Susan Olson's just saying thank you so much. Yeah.
Susan's a member on our committee too. So.
Okay. All right. So I guess we will end there. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate everything you shared. It was great to learn about you, as well as some history. I just appreciate you being here, for Carrie Lynn for reaching out to you, and for her part in this with working with you. So thank you so much for being here.
What a great thing you're doing, and building the skills to be able to manifest the love that I know you feel for your brothers and sisters.
So important. We want everyone to feel that, we are working on that in our stake. So
That's wonderful.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Thank you everyone for joining.